Let's talk about generational wealth, but more specifically, the 4 maturity warning signs you need to be watching for in your heirs in 2022. I'm Eric L. Donovan, the Mindset Disruption Strategist. So we love our heirs. It's the reason that we think about generational wealth, right? The idea of generational wealth is, how do I build up something that becomes a blessing to my children and my grandchildren? So we work really, really hard to do this, but there are actually 4 warning signs that you need to be watching for inside of your heirs before you consider leaving generational wealth. And so I'm going to talk about them today in 2 different formats, right? One, we're going to talk about Sandcastle maturity, which is this maturity that still needs to mature. It's not solid. It may look good from the outside, but you need to just be looking for the warning signs. You need to be paying attention, because when the waves come in, the maturity may completely fall apart, which means your heirs won't be ready for the generational wealth that you're intending to leave to them, versus kingdom maturity. What does it look like to have one or the other? How are they in contrast with each other? And how can you build it up inside of your heirs? So let's take a look. Number 1, the number 1 maturity warning sign that you need to be looking for is a lack of motivation to work. See, work is an important element of being able to earn resources, right? Earn our keep, earn money. And work is an important part of that. Whether that's doing schoolwork or actually going to a job on a regular basis. But it's very common when someone is trying to pass generational wealth, if they unintentionally create inside of their heirs a lack of motivation to work. I remember a family that we were serving a few years ago, and the grandfather had left a trust for the grandchild that the heir was good, that the grandson was going to receive just a few years after high school graduation. And his mom was talking to him, was like, hey, you need to get down and get to work. Your grades don't look that good. How are you going to get into college? How are you going to get a good job? And his comment was, I don't need to get a good job. When I turn 21, I get the trust that grandpa left to me, and I'm just going to live off of that. So from a generational wealth standpoint, what his grandfather had intended to be a blessing actually ended up creating a maturity issue, because now his grandson had a lack of motivation to work. Not a good situation from a generational wealth standpoint. And I'm going to pull these out from some different studies. The first one is the psychology of influence. I know done back in 1997, but trust me, it still is relative today. It's called the Golden Ghetto. It was done by Jessie O'Neill, and she found these issues to be there. And I want to put this in contrast to kingdom maturity. And before we unpack this really quick, all of these kingdom maturity ideas are coming from a great book called Raised, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise by Coventry Edwards Pitt. If you want to build generational wealth, I highly recommend this book to you. It's been a great blessing to me. It's where a lot of these kingdom principles are coming from. And just really quickly, I have no connection to Coventry Edwards Pitt at all. I just have read her book and think it is incredibly wise when considering generational wealth. So let's look at this kingdom maturity in contrast to someone who has a lack of motivation to work right now. Demonstrating from a kingdom maturity, the heir illustrates and demonstrates an ability to earn their own money. And one of the keys of generational wealth that Coventry Edwards Pitt found is having an heir understand that mom and dad have money. That doesn't mean that you have money. Mom and dad have success, but that doesn't mean that you have success. So there's a motivation inside of your children or your grandchildren, depending on where you're looking at leaving this generational wealth, to understand that you're going to have to figure this out. You're going to have to go out and earn your own money. You're going to have to figure out how to budget. You're going to have to figure out how to make life work, especially in your 20s. One of the things that was also found inside of this book is that the maturity from about 20 to 29 or so, and different kids mature at different places, right? But this is such an important phase that this is where you either build sandcastle or kingdom maturity, is right in this age range of 20 to 29. And that demonstrating their ability to earn their own money and not expect mom and dad to come in and bail them out was a key. What about number 2? The second area of maturity you really have to be looking at is an heir who demonstrates a lack of perseverance. So I think about a family that we were working with, it had to be about 6 or 7 years ago, who had a son who was, in some instances, maybe he'd call himself a serial entrepreneur, but none of the businesses that he went into were successful. He would go into a business, mom and dad would help him fund the business, he would go into it, it would not be successful, he wouldn't persevere through it, and he'd be like, well, that didn't work, and then he'd stop. And then he'd start another business, and mom and dad would help him fund the business, and then that didn't work, and he'd stop. And he had a series of business after business after business because he had no perseverance to stick it through. See, without the resources from mom and dad, he would have had to figure something else out, right? When we think that we're being a blessing to our children, to our grandchildren, by maybe helping them with a business, there's some communication, there's some other things that have to happen to make sure we're not accidentally sowing a seed of a lack of perseverance inside of that. In addition, kingdom maturity shows a motivation towards achieving personal goals, towards achieving things that are important to them, setting the goal and being able to persevere through it when things get hard. So starting a business, it's an idea that maybe there's a certain amount of money that's going to be there, but that's it, right? There's a budget of how much mom and dad have to help with the business, but it's limited. And we're here for counsel, but what would it look like for that end goal to be achieved? And putting your kids in a place to where they have to do hard things. The kingdom maturity is built in this motivation towards achieving their own personal goals and setting goals that are theirs, right? Not goals that mom and dad set for them, not goals that were set by their teachers or other family members, but goals that were personal, goals that meant something to them, so that when they achieved it, then it was their story. No one else had any influence about it. And it builds this maturity. It builds this certainty inside of our children, inside of our grandchildren. What about number 3? The third sandcastle maturity that we just got to watch out for is problems with relationships. I was at a conference of families of abundance, and one of the daughters got up on stage and she said one of her greatest problems was in relationships. Because of all the boys that she dated, they knew her family name and knew that she was going to be blessed with generational wealth. And she said, I just got to be honest with you. I constantly ask the question, are people dating me because of my name or because of who I am? Are they dating me for what I have financially and the opportunity that they feel like they'd have to be in this family versus me? See, the challenge when there is affluence and generational wealth passed down to heirs and others is, you go out with your friends, sometimes you just get expected to pay. Who else is going to pay? They've got the money. I don't have the money. Or if you're going to go do nice things, sometimes it feels like there's an obligation to help people do things. And that can then lead to creation of problems in relationships. And especially when someone is younger and forming their opinion of themselves, you see how that gets to be a struggle. While helping someone build kingdom maturity builds in barriers and conversations that helps them have a solid sense of self that's not wrapped up in issues related to wealth. So creating environments and things that your heir can go do, that your heirs can go to, your children, your grandchildren can go do, that has nothing tied to their name or who they are. I don't know if that's volunteering. I don't know if that's going off to school somewhere that's completely away from the community of where they grew up so that no one knows who they are and they can build their own reputation or build their own experience. It's also about In a family business, oftentimes our recommendation to business owners is let your heirs go work somewhere else and not under the name of the family. Because there's a lot of expectations that get built up inside of that, versus if they go out on their own and they can fail a little bit and they can learn about that, right? They then have that solid sense of self that has nothing to do with the wealth or the family name that they carry. So what can you do to create those opportunities? Because that builds kingdom maturity. And the last level of Sandcastle maturity that we just have to be careful of in 2022 centers around self-worth struggles, right? Who am I without this name? Who am I without this family? Who am I without this job? It's a hard thing. Who am I if my parents hadn't, let me grow up in this house? How do I wrestle with my struggles? How do I wrestle with the things that I've been given? And a lot of times there can be things that, the heirs get caught up in that have to do with this self-worth. And it's not what we want for our kids, right? We're thinking generational wealth. I want to make things easier. But if your grandchild is struggling from a self-worth standpoint, sometimes we've got to be careful, because there's this attitude of, wait a minute, we've blessed you. We've given this to you. Why don't you appreciate it? And what you're not recognizing is it's a maturity issue. And if we feed too much into, don't you appreciate what you've received, it even is a greater demand on the who am I, because they recognize they don't appreciate it because they're struggling with who they are outside of it. So inside of that conversation, are we feeding the maturity issue, or are we giving them a path forward? And so the other side of this from a kingdom maturity issue is that they know they can overcome setbacks, and they know that it was them that was overcoming the setback. Like nobody came to rescue them. No one came to save them. No one came to bail them out. It was something that they did on their own. And in doing that, they build their own self-confidence and their own self-worth. This is not easy. But when you look at leaving generational wealth, you really have to look at these maturity levels. Is there a lack of motivation to work? Is there a lack of perseverance? Are there problems with relationships? Are there self-worth struggles? And if there are you willing to see them so that you can help your family member wrestle through them, so that the generational wealth you leave is a blessing to them and not a burden to them? If I summarize this book on raised, healthy, wealthy, and wise, it comes down to just a few things. And if we want kingdom maturity and kingdom wealth, here's what they said. One is to do not plan much, if any, of an inheritance for your kids in their 20s. Don't let them think that they've got anything coming, because that helps them understand that they've got to work. They've got to do it on their own. They've got to figure it out. And the 20s, again, are such a special time of just shaping and understanding and becoming who you are. The other thing that they said, so nothing in the 20s. The second thing that Coventry Edwards Pitt really discovers inside of here is letting them know that they're going to have to figure it out on their own, but that mom and dad have their back on an emotional and a relational standpoint. Like, you're going to let them fail, but at the same time, you're still going to love them. Not that you're going to bail them out, right? But that you're going to be standing behind them and standing beside them when they fail, so that you can help them understand how to see around it. And those two things really go a long way towards building kingdom maturity. There's much more, and a lot of what I already talked about here, but those two things, keep that in mind, because if your desire is to leave generational wealth, if your heart is to bless this generation, the next generation, and generations that come after you, you have to put plans in place to help them build their maturity, right? And from a relational standpoint, you can help build maturity in your children. You might be able to help build maturity in your grandchildren, but what are you going to do 4, 5, 6 generations down the road? Because this is way too important. We find generational wealth fails, 90% of generational wealth fails after the third generation, and much of it is a maturity issue. So I encourage you to watch for these 4 warning signs and build inside of your generational wealth plans to create kingdom maturity. Do not neglect this. This is the real key opportunity for all families who desire to build generational wealth. Thank you so much for being with me. God bless you.